All right, well, we're going to finish up our little story from last week. We didn't quite get through it, but just to remind you, the Reformation in France starts really with Louis XII. He was the counterpart of Henry VII. He kind of brings order. His son-in-law succeeded him, Francis I, married to his daughter, Claudia, you recall. His son, Henry II, was married to Catherine de' Medici. And that becomes a defining personality, Catherine does, for the next several generations of kings, because she continues to be the dominant political and religious personality in France for the next several years. Henry, of course, ruled until 1559. You recall he died in the joust, remember that? Celebrating his truce with Philip II. That brought his second son. His first son had already died as a child. His second son was Francis II, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, who ruled only for a year. He died. That brought their third son, Charles IX, who was only 10 years old when he became the king. So Catherine de' Medici is the sort of matriarch of the country. She is steering the good ship France and dominating its political and religious outlook, and of course having a completely overwhelming influence on her young son, Charles X, who, as I say, is only 10 years old. During the years of his reign, you have an increasing crescendo of violence in France as the conflict between the Huguenots on the one hand and the Catholic forces on the other, more or less under the control of Catherine, increasingly engage in violent clashes and bloodshed around the land until finally it seemed that peace had been achieved. And the peace was going to be predicated on a marriage between the son of Jeanne d'Albret, who we talked about last week. Her son, Henry of Navarre, would marry the sister of Charles IX, and on that basis a truce would be achieved because Henry, son of Jeanne, was Huguenot. He was Protestant. Catherine, the sister of Charles, was Catholic. Jeanne d'Albret had the gravest of misgivings. But in the face of the evident violence, she thought, maybe this is God's solution to this horrific years of clashing and bloodletting. The marriage took place. Jeanne d'Albret herself, as you recall, died only 2 months before the wedding under suspicious circumstances, but never been proved. There was foul play. The marriage happened. 3 days later was the Feast of St. Bartholomew. The Huguenots had crowded into Paris, feeling that this was the dawning of a new day. They left their armaments at home. They came in thinking, finally we have a time of peace and tranquility. And when their guard was utterly down and they were utterly unexpecting it, there was this release of violent attacks against them, ordered by Charles, who is now 21 years old, behind the scenes Catherine, and the entire military assault on the Huguenots was a bloodbath. Historians differ as to how many people were killed. The lowest estimate you'll generally hear, these are the best seats right up here. Welcome, really that's well. Good. Hey, yeah, that's right. How are you? Absolutely. The lowest estimate you'll hear would be about 5,000 people. That's the lowest estimate. Estimates upward range upward to about 30,000 maybe in one day. And then that violent clash extended out through France for the next several months. This met with a huge negative reaction, of course, as you can imagine, not only across France, especially the Huguenots who survived, and many did. There were many more Huguenots in France than those, but across Europe as well, because it was simply a complete act of dishonesty, a breach of trust of the most unimaginable proportions, not a fair fight in any sense, you know. And so the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre comes down to this day as one of those very ugly moments in the history of this warfare. Charles himself died 2 years later at 23 years old. Not altogether clear. Many think he died of the crushing sense of guilt. I don't know that. That's a theory, but nevertheless he died. That brings the fourth son now of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici, and she is still, see, the dominant personality. and this guy's name is Henry III. And this is him pictured here. He was the chief military commander in the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre. He was about 20 years old, and he was actually the commander of the forces. So he also bore significant responsibility for the massacre. He also was feeling a huge amount of guilt. The public opinion against him in the international community there was so crushing that he himself finally was trying to figure out some way out from under the sense of the wrongdoing that had taken place, that actually 2 years after he became the king, he was able to negotiate an accord with the Huguenots. They were obviously much more wary this time around, weren't drawn into this quite so easily. But nevertheless, he did achieve a basis for a kind of peace treaty, if you will, between the Catholic rule of France and the Huguenot population there in France, and that was just 2 years later in 1576. As it turns out, that precipitated a huge reaction against him from the Catholics. And so, led by a guy named Henry, who was called the Duke of Guise, of the Guise family there in France, the Catholic League was organized against him, and all of a sudden Henry III, who was himself a Catholic and the son of Catherine de' Medici, nevertheless finds himself now under attack by his own Catholic side because he's tried to mend fences, you see, with the Protestant Huguenots there. So this becomes an ongoing conflict and becomes an increasingly threatening aspect of life in France. He has to always be watching his backside. He was living in complete paranoia, but you know the old saying about paranoia. It doesn't mean they're not out to get you, and so he's feeling that, and it really is to some degree the case. But it all sort of changes in 1588. 1588 is, as you know, the year of the Spanish Armada. We usually think about the Spanish Armada simply as the defeat of a big fleet that came from Spain and was attacking England, and it certainly was that. But there was a whole lot more going on. Philip II, the King of Spain, who spent huge amounts of money on this project against the counsel of his best military strategists, believed God was in it. Philip believed that this was God's moment, who from his point of view, God must be a Catholic, that this was God's moment to rid Europe of the Protestant movement, this treason against the true church as he saw it. And so even though his counselors were advising him that this was a dangerous ploy at best, he believed that God was going to give blessing and success. And so he spent a huge amount of his wealth. Spain at this time was the wealthiest country in Europe. He invested a huge amount of that wealth into this fleet. They looked impressive. They sailed away. It looked like no one could resist them. But of course, there was a kind of vulnerability that might not have been so evident to them, but certainly was evident to Francis Drake and some of those who fought on behalf of Elizabeth. Interestingly, it wasn't just the adroit tactics of Francis Drake and those with him and the English ships, which were much more maneuverable, of course, you know the story of the battle itself, but the weather itself turned against the Spanish Armada, and as many ships, or probably more ships, were destroyed by weather than they were by the counter-assault from the English. They were washed up against the reefs. There were all kinds of catastrophes, and it was just a very tiny, beleaguered skeleton that limped its way home after that catastrophe, known as the Spanish Armada. Well, this had a psychological impact in Europe because many people, not just Spanish, but all through the Catholic world, believed God was going to now vindicate his cause. And it seemed to be just the opposite. And it did represent quite a setback, not only for the Spanish, but for all of them. And Francis, who is now, you see, under attack by the Catholic side in France, believed this was his opportunity. And so he engages in a little bit of subterfuge himself. He invites over Henry, the Duke of Guise, to have a little conversation, and when Henry is least expecting it, slips a knife into his back. So Henry Guise, who's been leading the Catholic League against Henry III, the nice thing about all of this is that they're all named Henry. Makes it a lot easier to remember, you know. If in doubt, call him Henry. So anyway, Henry assassinates Henry, and he thinks he can do that because, you see, the whole momentum of the Catholic cause has sort of taken it on the chops after the defeat of the Armada. Well, it was a bit of a miscalculation because it actually triggered an even more ferocious assault against Henry III and forced Henry III to join, guess who? Henry of Navarre, the son of Jean d'Albret, who's ruling in Navarre and is a strong Protestant. So Henry III has been sort of painted into this Protestant corner, even though he's still a Catholic in his heart. One of those wonderful, brilliant ironies of history, you know. So here he is, joining forces with a Protestant, Henry of Navarre, against the Catholics against him in France because of his own activity. Well, as it turns out, Henry III was assassinated by a Dominican friar. I think his name was Henry, in 1589. And that's the end of Henry III. And oddly enough, who does it bring to the throne? Our good friend Henry IV, son of Jean d'Albret, Huguenot, raised by his mother as a Huguenot Protestant. And I think the guy's good looking. Don't you think so? You know, I'm sorry, you can't see this very much as well as I can here, but someday we'll do something about the lighting. But anyway, kind of a debonair looking guy. I don't know. I think it must be, yeah. Henry IV, last name of Bourbon. If you remember this from last week, Jean d'Albret had married a Bourbon, which was one of the ruling families in France. They were the Protestant nobility. And so his last name was Bourbon. He was a Frenchman in the sense that his father was French and his mother was, of course, from Navarre. He had ruled Navarre, that little province to the south of France, north of Spain, since 1572. His mother died in 1572, as we were alluding to earlier. And so he's a fairly seasoned ruler already. But of course, because of his connections to France through his father, and because of the just family relationships otherwise, he was actually the next in line. And so he comes to the throne in France legitimately, but as you can imagine, the Catholic League, if they didn't like Henry III, they really didn't like Henry IV, because now they've got a Protestant ruling France. You know, it's bad enough to have a Catholic who's wobbly, much worse to have what amounts to a Huguenot ruling France. And so it really does have the tendency to mobilize even a more ferocious assault against Henry. So much so, I'm sorry to say, that in 1593 he renounced Protestantism. He was so embattled that really he thought that was the only way to protect his claim to rule France and to prevent open civil war. And so in 1593 he renounced Protestantism. His mother rolled over several times in her grave, but that's a different story, and he was able to secure the throne. Many historical commentators, of course, secular commentators view all of this with a very cynical perspective, and of course they see people changing their faith at the drop of a hat for political advantage, and they sort of dust off Henry in the same spirit, and I'm not so sure what was going on in his heart. I know it was a calculated decision for political reasons, and I'm not endorsing it by any means, but I think he at the same time felt that maybe if he sided with the Catholics, he could actually do more for the Protestants than kind of maintaining this open hostility against the Catholics. I don't know, but anyway, it did turn out that 5 years later, one of the most important and far-reaching accords, one of the most lasting and stable accords between Catholics and Protestants did occur under Henry's guidance and under his strategic planning there in 1598, called the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes became an extremely important accord in France, and it maintained the stability, you might say, religiously in France for many, many years to come. It was several decades before it was revoked by Louis XIV, whose name you recognize, and that did trigger some interesting repercussions around Europe. But at least this was kind of the end of the bloodletting in France. And so in the religious wars, when we think about this one, the wars in France, then it comes to a conclusion more or less under Henry Navarre and the Edict of Nantes. That did increase his popularity, but even he was assassinated by kind of a fanatic monk in 1610. And that brings his son, Louis XIII, to the throne in France. You know that Louis XIII dominates the first half of the 17th century, and Louis XIV dominates the last half. Those two Louis. Louis XIII, of course, is famous for several reasons. He's kind of the run-up to what's called absolutism. He remains Catholic, and he is essentially Catholic throughout his rule, although he has apparently some kind of subtle appreciation for the Huguenots. Certainly some of what he does seems to recognize that. But the most important thing about him politically is this is the beginning of what's called European absolutism. Remember that Europe is still kind of finding its way. During the Renaissance and the Reformation, you begin to see the rise of what are called the nation states. Before that, it had really been feudalism. There were no nation states. That's the nation of France, the nation of Germany. These are still just evolving. They're still coming along. They haven't really formulated yet. But the theory that was beginning to develop was that these nation states should be under the rule of an absolute monarch. The debate is most famously a political debate between two Englishmen, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who are contemporaries. They are 17th century characters. As a rule, it was the Northern European countries touched by the Reformation that began to steer in the direction of representative, or what would technically be called republican or constitutional governance. Division of labor, limited authority, that kind of checks and balances. That was John Locke, who was a Puritan. He grew up in a Puritan home. His father was a Puritan lawyer. So John Locke really carries that out and makes it a secular vision of how to do politics. Hobbes, on the other hand, was the great genius behind the notion of absolutism in his famous book, Leviathan, where a political body should have one absolute, unquestioned, unchallengeable ruler whose word is law. The Catholic countries in the south of Europe tended much more heavily toward absolutism. In England, it became a conflict between constitutional and absolutist governing. You see, that was what led to the Puritan revolt. But as a rule, in the broader scheme of things, that's what's going on. So Louis XIII is really the one who provides kind of a building block toward absolutism. That's one of the reasons that he's famous, and we'll be coming back and kind of noticing that in our discussion of 17th century events anyway. Another thing that makes him interesting is that, of course, if you know the legend, the lore of the Three Musketeers, that's under Louis XIII. The Three Musketeers, of course, had to deal with a character whose name was Cardinal Richelieu. You ever heard of Cardinal Richelieu? Now, Cardinal Richelieu was one of the most, what would you say, Machiavellian cardinals in the history of European politics. He was a brilliant political strategist. Now, I don't know about the Three Musketeers, but I know Cardinal Richelieu was a real guy, and he was the main advisor to Louis XIII. And even though I don't share a lot in common with the political views of Cardinal Richelieu, I like the guy personally. Well, that's, by the way, Louis XIII, because I once played him. That is Cardinal Richelieu, being played by yours truly, stage play a few years ago. If you can't quite see that, those are flowers that the Cardinal is holding. Paper flowers made for him by his grandkids right after the play. So anyway, Cardinal Richelieu and I, we're sort of tight, you know, but anyway. All right, let's move on from there. We've looked at France and that, and now I'd like to shift our focus to this region, which we would call Germany, but at the time is still the Holy Roman Empire. The rule of the Holy Roman Empire, as you may recall, is based on an election. So the Holy Roman Empire is a patchwork of various provinces under dukes and rulers and so on, small kingdoms, and they would elect, on the death of one, the next ruler. And it was not hereditary. It was simply a matter of winning the popular election among these who were the electors. The guy who was the protector of Martin Luther was called Duke Frederick, Elector of Saxony, because he had the right to elect the next ruler. Well, the guy who's elected at this point is a man named Ferdinand, and he became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1619. He was of the Habsburg family, which was in Austria. So this is a picture of what the Holy Roman Empire looked like at the time. And again, I hope that's fairly visible. But you'll see Austria down in the lower right is really the dominant region. It's the largest region. It was the most powerful. The Habsburg family had been traditionally ruling Austria for many generations, and it was not uncommon for a Habsburg to be elected to this position of Holy Roman Emperor. So he was one of several Habsburgs who had already held this role up until this time. I want you all to take 15 seconds and memorize that map, because I'm going to refer to it and I'm not going to keep showing it to you. But just notice that immediately north of Austria is Bohemia. Looking up a little higher, if you notice there, you've got Magdeburg, sort of in the center there. You've got Westphalia. You've got other regions, and I'm going to be mentioning their names, and so if you'll just kind of remember that you heard them here, it'll keep it in mind. These are all places that had some role to play in the story that we're about to tell. Ferdinand himself was given a strong Jesuit education. You recall the Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius Loyola, 1540, were formed for the stated purpose of eradicating Protestantism from the face of the earth. That was his vision. And these were the people who were, as I said earlier, the special ops of the Catholic Church. They would go in largely to Protestant countries and engaged in usually covert operations of various kinds in order to not only galvanize the Catholic population living sometimes as a persecuted, sometimes minority in Protestant countries, but also many times to engage in various kinds of strategies and schemes to undermine and hopefully overthrow the Protestant leadership. There were a lot of Jesuits, for example, in England who were doing that kind of thing, and elsewhere in Protestant parts of Europe at the time. So the Jesuits had an agenda. This was just not a detached education, you see. They were really inculcating a certain vision into this young, soon-to-be ruler of Austria, Ferdinand, and he basically incorporated it. He became a deep believer in the vision of the Jesuits. He was still quite a young man when he took the throne of Austria, but even then, he began a policy of rather severe suppression of non-Catholics. But as he was able to consolidate his own power, his own convictions along those lines became increasingly pronounced. And by the time he became the Holy Roman Emperor in 1619, he had pretty much put together a policy of, at least under the domains that he controlled, ridding it of all Protestants. That was really his design, his plan. So he was ready to roll that policy out in 1619. The first thing he did was to reverse the Peace of Augsburg. Now remember, he's also an absolutist. The absolutism as a political philosophy was dominating Catholic countries. We see that in France, Louis XIII. We see it in the Holy Roman Emperor. It had not been that way up until this point. He's sort of taking a step in a direction that is increasing his own power, and it's a bit of a risky step because some of these people that elected him were somewhat independent, but nevertheless he does this. The Peace of Augsburg was an accord that had been in place for over 50 years in empire. Martin Luther died in 1546, so this is only 10 years later after the death of Luther. There was a fair amount of violent squabbling going on after Luther's death between Catholic and Protestant provinces, and There was a belief, of course, among some of these who were ruling that rather than just open the doors to an ongoing bloodbath that's going to last for decades, why don't we just sit down at a table and figure this thing out? And the Peace of Augsburg was really an attempt to establish a kind of live and let live policy in the Holy Roman Empire. And it was based on this essential notion. Each province should be free to go the direction it wanted. The ruler of the province should be able to determine whether that province would be Protestant or Catholic, and there would be a freedom of immigration, so that if you're in a Catholic province and you are a Protestant, you can freely migrate to a Protestant region, that sort of thing. And it worked. And so Germany now had been relatively peaceful compared to a lot of what was going on elsewhere for a good long time. Ferdinand comes to the Holy Roman Empire and he reverses that policy. So exercising what he saw as his absolutist rights, he repudiates that and launches what has to be described as a brutal attack against Protestants, first of all in Austria and then in Bohemia. And this was brutal. He would go into communities, little villages and so on, and basically just slaughter all of the Protestants who were there. And some of these villages were all Protestant, you see, and so he'd just go in and they'd all be dead. Men, women, children across the board. Town after town, city after city, and he carried this on with a kind of methodical sort of detachment, just basically destroying, as if his vision was to simply kill every Protestant in the Holy Roman Empire. The only problem he had was he ran out of money. It's not a very profitable venture, you see, and so by about 1625, he has to hire someone to pick up this cause on his behalf, who was a mercenary and didn't give a rip about religion. The man's name was Albrecht von Wallenstein, and he took the job on the agreement that he could run this war on his own terms, and that anything that was recovered in the form of loot or booty would go to him and to his men. So at this point, this campaign against Protestants became somewhat less than religious and more just a campaign of pillage and violence. And in many cases, it wasn't just Protestants, but even Catholics were caught in the crossfire. It sort of lost its focus a little bit already about this time, although certainly the bulk of the assault was against Protestants. By the time we get to 1629, 10 years into the 30 Years' War, basically all the Catholic properties in a lot of the Holy Roman Empire had been restored to the Catholic Church. Many Protestants had been killed. Many others had been driven into hiding. It was a very horrific time, and it looked as if Ferdinand was going to realize his vision there in that region. The beleaguered Protestants had gotten some help from the King of Denmark, who had come down and attempted to assist. But his army was no match for Albrecht, and basically he was routed in 2 or 3 battles, and Denmark itself was put at risk as a result of that. So the Protestants, now even more beleaguered, appeal to Gustav, who was the King of Sweden. And Gustav Adolphus, the King of Sweden, receives this. He, of course, is aware of all of these things that are going on. He's been ruling in Sweden since the year 1611. He came to the throne as a quite young man, about 12 years old. He was challenged several times in his rule, even as a teenager, kind of like Alexander the Great. He showed such military genius that he was able to basically, by stratagems, defend not only his throne, but defend Sweden, and really established himself as quite a remarkable military genius, even by the time he was in his late teenage years. He's been ruling successfully now Sweden. It's been a time of peace and general prosperity. He is well loved. He's a strong and quite outspoken and conspicuous Christian following in the tradition of the Reformation, and he's very public about it and calls his people to public expressions of worship. He's generally in the Calvinist tradition, and so this is the character who now gets this appeal for help from the Holy Roman Empire. He addressed the Diet of Stockholm, essentially his parliament, in 1630. He received this appeal. He gave it serious consideration because, you see, he didn't have a dog in that fight exactly. There was nothing in it to gain, everything to lose. But at the same time, he really did believe that this entire Protestant presence in Germany was going to be lost forever unless somebody jumped in and did something. And so after giving it a fair amount of prayerful consideration, he addressed the Diet of Stockholm with the following words. So this is in part, of course. Now I am about to begin a most important struggle. Emperor Ferdinand has forced me to resort to arms. He has insulted us and persecuted our friends, our religious brethren who sigh for deliverance. With the help of God, they will not have sighed in vain. I know the dangers. This is why before leaving the country, I commend you body and soul to Almighty God, that He may protect you and unite us all together in heaven. Yes, dear people of Sweden, I commend you to the protection of God and bid you farewell, perhaps forever. He knew that this was a perilous venture and that the chances were extremely good he would not return alive. But anyway, he believes this is what God is calling him to do. He crossed the Baltic, arrived in Germany. It was a perilous journey. The weather was against them. They were torn around by storms and so on. And yet, as it turns out, every one of the men who departed Sweden arrived safely. Famously, Gustav got down on his knees once they were safely on terra firma once again, got down on his knees, raised his hands to heaven in front of all of his military who were there with him, and prayed in part the following prayer, quote, "My Lord and my God, who rule the winds and the seas, how can I praise you and thank you for the protection you granted during the dangerous voyage? I give you thanks from the depths of my heart. You know, O Lord, I haven't come for my own glory, but to help your oppressed church, protect us, and bring us victory in this sacred work." Greatly outnumbered, but with strategies that were just almost, well, inspired, I guess you would say, he won an extraordinary string of successes in several battles against the imperial forces, kicking them back on their heels. They had thought they would make quick work of this young upstart. He's about 35 years old at this point. They had greatly underestimated him. And so again and again, the imperial forces are being pushed back and are losing this contest. They finally are so distressed, that is, the imperial forces are so distressed that they completely withdraw, almost feigning a kind of defeat, but actually they traveled to a fairly distant location called Magdeburg. It was on that map I showed you earlier. They went to the main city of Magdeburg, which had a population of about 33,000 people and was almost all Protestant. They broke into the city without any advance warning, essentially torched it, took all of the clergy in the city, pulled them out in the street, poured oil on them and set them on fire, locked men and women inside churches and set those on fire. And for sport, this is documented, these mercenary soldiers would take little children and just toss them into the bonfire. It was just a ghastly, kind of horrific, outrageous event, totally unnecessary and way beyond the top, even in those times. When Gustav heard of it, he broke down in tears, feeling he'd failed, that he hadn't seen what was up and hadn't been able to anticipate that, and he felt like he was completely blindsided. He called together those who were with him, and others had joined him by now, and he said, you know, we have to stop this. And so they traveled north, and they actually met the forces, the imperial forces, at a battlefield called Breitenfeld. Again, he was greatly outnumbered. This is a battle. If this were a course in military history, we'd look at it. It's a lot of fun, but that's obviously beyond our scope. But it is studied to this day as an extremely interesting exercise in genius with small numbers versus power with great numbers, and the way he was able to essentially capitalize and use the powers of this army against them to win this victory was really quite a remarkable thing. And it did basically stop the advance of this imperial assault on the Protestants there. This was kind of the turning point. This is a painting that celebrates Gustav at the Battle of Breitenfeld, painted by Johann Walter. Before the battle, Gustav addressed his men in the following words, quote, "I count on the justice of our cause even more than our arms and our allies, for we fight for the glory of God and the true evangelical faith. The God of goodness, who has miraculously brought us across the seas and rivers through fortresses and enemies, will strengthen us to conquer. This is why we attack with courage. God is with us. May these words be our rallying cry, and with the help of Almighty God, the victory will be ours." At which time we once again, on his knees, prayed as follows, "Good God, you hold in your hand victory and defeat. Turn your merciful face to us, your servants. We have come far. We have left our peaceful homes to fight in this country for liberty and for your gospel. Glorify your holy name in granting us victory," which indeed is exactly what happened. Ferdinand, of course, realizing that he was being pushed back and was losing rapidly, regrouped, basically assembled an entirely new force, and went out hoping in one last effort to try to do away with Gustav. And this took place at a battle known as the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. It was a foggy day. Gustav got separated from his men. He took a shoulder wound from a musket, knocked him off his saddle. The people who had just shot him came up to determine who he was. Upon asking who he was, he said the following words, quote, "I am the King of Sweden, and this day I seal with my blood the liberty and the religion of the German nation." And they immediately shot him, and that was the end of Gustav. Interestingly, Louis XIII, the absolutist Catholic of France, entered on the Protestant side a year and a half later. Not so much for religious reasons, because by this time the conflict was becoming fully political, and he was in some ways protecting dynastic interests there as well. But as it turns out, he came in fighting for the Protestants in 1634. That forced Ferdinand to sign a peace agreement in 1635 called the Peace of Prague. It was a guarded truce. It didn't end the conflict, but it did at least kind of mitigate it to some degree. It's a 30 years war. It did go on for another 10 years or so, but at a somewhat reduced level until finally the Peace of Westphalia, a very famous peace agreement in 1648, right in the middle of the 17th century, brings the 30 Years' War, this horrific bloodbath, to a conclusion. Many people would say the turning point was the participation of Gustav right in the midst of that. The general provisions of the Peace of Westphalia, which continued to dominate then in the Holy Roman Empire and eventually in Germany, were the following. The parties would recognize the Peace of Augsburg. It was reinstated, in which each prince would have the right to determine the religion of his own state. The options by that were Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism. So every ruler could determine the religion of his state. With this added exception, Christians living in principalities where their denomination was not the established church were guaranteed the right to practice their faith in public during allotted hours and in private at their will. It was a remarkable, and to us that seems like, kind of an obvious thing, but at that time in history that was a remarkable kind of development. And finally, general recognition of the sovereignty of each ruler of his land, and also the issuance of unrestricted letters of marque and reprisal to privateers was forbidden. The whole use of mercenaries at that point was outlawed. So it was quite a remarkable development, and that did bring then in continental Europe a time of some extended peace, at least as far as the religious conflicts were concerned. There were certainly other conflicts that came along, but the religious wars more or less subsided at that point. We're going to shift our focus come next week to England. I'm going to start limiting the scope of our conversation basically to England and Scotland, and then we're going to follow these people across the ocean to America. 1648 was the Peace of Westphalia. 1632 was what? Massachusetts Bay Colony. I mean, these things are happening at the same time, so we'll start looking at some of that drama as well. Let me just finish by coming back to this psalm and a couple of things here to note. This is the Sunday school lesson, because this is, my friends, Sunday school. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war, and my fingers for battle. This psalm is an elegant psalm in 4 paragraphs. The first of them, David celebrates that God has given to him, David, skills of war. He's trained his hands, he's trained his fingers, he's made David a skillful warrior. The second paragraph, however, balances that with the following. Bow your heavens, O Lord, and come down. Touch the mountains so that they smoke. The entire point of the second paragraph is to say, I don't care how much skill I've gotten, I don't care how brilliant I am, the victory is the Lord's. God works through means, but God is the one who determines outcomes. I can never take that as an excuse to be lazy, but I can never take my diligence as an excuse to be arrogant. I also have to rely utterly on God's provision, and so it's that balance. The third paragraph, I will sing a new song to you upon a 10-stringed harp, the one who gives victory to kings and rescues his servant David. So as David celebrates the two sides of this, being a trained warrior and yet relying on God, he can then, in the proper sense, with proper humility, and yet at the same time with the sense that he's participated meaningfully in this thing, celebrate the victory that has been given by God. And that's the point of the third paragraph. And then the fourth paragraph describes the great blessings that flow as a result. May our sons in their youth be like plants full grown, and so on. May our barns be filled, etc. That the blessing that comes is through using, with God's power, the gifts and skills that he's given us. Now, I know some of you in this room have a military background, and I say, God bless you. None of us, to my knowledge right now, are active military, except that we are. Because the New Testament tells us to put on the armor of God, and tells us that we are in a war. And if we think we're not, then we are deluded and naive. There is a war going on, and we are in it. And there are forces that are at this very moment attempting to take what is properly the province of King Jesus. And he has called us to fight that battle, never thinking we can win it on our own, but never thinking we can shrink from the task because, we don't know what we're doing or some such thing. He has called us, as David was called, to be participants in this battle. The kings of the earth have taken their stand, my friends, against the Lord and against his anointed. The kings of the earth are saying, let's shake off the shackles of God. Let's throw away God's law and do it our own way. We are smarter than God. That's what the kings of the earth are saying. And we as God's people hear that and sometimes tremble because we think, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? Little do we know that God has put his Son on Mount Zion so that the one who sits in heaven scoffs at the pretenses of the rulers of this world who think they can shake their fist in God's face. We are on the winning team. We are on the winning side of this conflict, and though we may occasionally feel somewhat beleaguered, we need to celebrate that God has trained our hands for war. And he's given us the equipment to fight this battle against principalities and powers and mights and dominions. Ultimately, sometime soon, or maybe sometime much later, ultimately bringing glory and victory to the Lord Jesus Christ. So my friends, you are warriors. I am a warrior. Let's fight this battle using not the instruments of flesh and blood, but the instruments of God's Spirit to the building of his kingdom and the vindicating of his name. Amen.